Hello, I'm Gail Persicelli, and I'll be serving as your moderator for today's ILTA webinar, 10 Tips for a Healthy SharePoint Environment. Our speakers today are Ted Theodoropoulos and Brian Goff. And I would also like to thank AcroWire for hosting this sponsoring this webinar. Their sponsorship is vital in keeping the ILTA webinars free to our members. Today's presentation will run about 45 to 60 minutes. And we ask that you please submit all questions to the Q&A box, and if those are not answered during the presentation, they will be addressed at the end. Before we start, please know that we are recording today's webinar and will post a link to our website under recording shortly after today's presentation. I'll now turn over the webinar to Ted and Brian.
Thank you, Gail, and you did a great job pronouncing both our names, so thank you very much.
You're quite welcome.
Okay, so 10 tips for a healthy SharePoint environment. Today we're going to talk about some very tactical steps that you can take to ensure a SharePoint farm is healthy. And the good news here is that many of these tips are very easy to implement, and they prevent disasters. And while many of these tips seem like no-brainers, the bad news is that on average, we see that most firms perform less than half of the steps that we have outlined here in this presentation today. And more bad news is that many firms assume that these things are being done, and when they find out is when there's a failure and it's too late. So again, we'll end with some good news, which is these steps are very easy and painless to implement. There's a lot of automation opportunities to accomplish some of these. And if you do all 10 of these things, you'll have fewer outages, you'll have a more responsive user experience, and you'll have happier end users overall. So before we jump in, let's do some quick introductions. I'm Ted Theodoropoulos, founder and president of AcroWire. Been in the IT business for many years. I had a stint at Microsoft on the SQL support team, and 10 years at Bank of America in several risk management roles, including IT audit and operational risk. I'm a certified Scrum Master and Lean Six Sigma Black Belt. And I also have Brian Goff, and I'll let Brian introduce himself.
All right, thank you, Ted. So I'm one of the solutions architects with AcroWire, and my focus is on the SharePoint technologies. I've been working in the Microsoft space for over 20 years. The past 10 years or so now have been primarily focused on SharePoint. Started out as a SharePoint developer and then have slowly migrated into more of a SharePoint administrative role. During all my years working with SharePoint, I've twice been recognized by Microsoft as a SharePoint MVP, and I continue to stay as active as I can in the different SharePoint communities with user groups. So excited to be here, and hopefully we'll give you some good information to help keep your farms up and running and keep your users happy.
Okay, so today it's a very simple agenda. We're going to start off with a SharePoint poll to get a handle on how critical the SharePoint environment is for the attendees today. We're going to define what a healthy SharePoint environment means, because that can mean a lot of different things to different people. And we're going to go through our 10 tips, and then we'll wrap up with a brief summary of a product that we offer called SharePoint MD that can help you get a handle on really where your firm is today in terms of health. So AcroWire, just to give you a little perspective on what we do and some understanding of really where our expertise lies, we probably do more SharePoint services work in legal than anyone. We do everything from custom development, portal branding, migrating firms from one version of SharePoint to another. We have a managed service offering where we can proactively perform a lot of the steps that we're going to talk through today. And then we also hammer out governance and information architecture documents for folks when they're in the planning phases. On the application development side, we're a Microsoft Shop through and through. So we do standalone app dev that really has nothing to do with SharePoint. And then on the data side, we do some BI work on the SQL stack. Envisioning, this is where most, if not all, of SharePoint engagements should start, and many of them are starting with envisioning. So this is really a function of implementing appropriate project leadership from the get-go. We see a lot of IT projects that get handicapped during the planning phase and never really get set on a firm foundation and have challenges all the way through. So we like to get brought in the early stages when you're thinking about maybe a new version of SharePoint or standing up a new portal altogether. We come in, do some requirements gathering. We've got some great tools at our disposal, wireframes, pre-baked user stories, so that we can establish a reasonable cost estimate and a timeline so that you can set expectations properly with your stakeholders. And next, I'd like to start with a poll, and really what I'm looking for here is an understanding of how critical your firm's SharePoint environment is today. So from 1 to 5, 1 being not critical, you guys are using it kind of as a glorified file share, or 5, extremely critical, where you've got line of business applications hosted in SharePoint. You know, your intranet is built on SharePoint. You maybe have a firm directory that people count on that's part of your SharePoint environment. So from 1 to 5, Gail, if you'll let me know when that's complete.
Okay. Right now, you got about 26% for 4 and 5, 21 for 3, 20 for 2, and 6% for 1.
Okay. And that's pretty representative of what we see in our experience. SharePoint is extremely popular in legal, especially in bigger firms. I think from the way ILTA segments firms is from 150 to 349, 350 to 700, and 700 and up. So with firms with more than 150 attorneys, north of 80% have implemented SharePoint in a production capacity based on the tech survey. So, and there's a little bit of variation in terms of how it's being used, but we see SharePoint often as part and parcel to their matter-centric pages and firm directories, sometimes legal project management sites that get deployed on SharePoint. So those are all very important line of business apps, and I think you'll benefit from the tips that we have today. And I'm going to kick it over to Brian so he can talk about what healthy means.
All right, thank you, Ted. So for the purpose of what we're going to be reviewing here today, wanted to kind of give a level set for when we're talking about healthy. What are we taking into account in regards to your SharePoint farm? So there are several components and pieces and parts to SharePoint, right? So some of the big pieces being your database servers. All the content from SharePoint will be stored on your database servers. You've got backups and restores. You have the process for creating sites, and how quickly does that occur, and how easy is it for your users? Is search being performant? Is it really helping you find the content that you're looking for? As well as the overall user experience. Are they able to open documents quickly or upload documents in a timely manner? So we want to look at all these different aspects and areas to determine, is your farm truly healthy or not? All right. So we'll start with tip number 1 to go over your healthy farm. So much like we as human beings, right, for us to stay healthy, we have regular checkups, right? Hopefully you do. The same with your SharePoint farm, proactively monitoring, keeping an eye on your farm. We have here as, like a general rule of thumb, do some monitoring on your system every month. So, that's with certain areas within SharePoint. There's some monitoring that you should be doing on a daily basis, right? So are the servers, up and running? If you have multiple web front ends doing a load balancing, maybe the farm, the site is being rendered, and that's good, but one of your web front ends is doing all the work. The other one is down for one reason or not available, right? So are you monitoring and looking at them as, individual entities? So there are several tools that can be used depending on, what resources you have at your availability in your various shops. Some of the tools that we mentioned below, like Microsoft System Center, the Service Manager. That is a suite of several different tools that you can leverage from Microsoft for monitoring the health of your hardware, be it your web front ends and SharePoint servers or your database servers, even some of your storage, different LUNs and storage areas for it. So a lot of capabilities there. SQL Sentry. So if you want something very specific to monitoring your SQL databases and how well, how performant they are, how large are your logs, how's everything being managed properly. AvePoint is another well-known product in the marketplace for monitoring your SharePoint farm and the various aspects of that. So depending on what you have in place, some of your, your network or your hardware folks might be already aware of System Center. Your DBAs might have their own tools or be aware of SQL Sentry or something else. But as long as you do have some tools to help you automate that process, to keep an eye on your farm. Is it up and running? Are you, getting the proper response times? Something that's giving you that information before the users start to complain is always a good thing. So proactively monitoring is a very major piece to it. Okay. Tip number 2, with regards to your SharePoint world, again, check all the different configurations that you have. There are several what they call service applications in SharePoint. A service application can be things from your user profile service, right? What are you using to pull from your membership provider, like maybe Active Directory? Who are the users? What are their names, emails, phone numbers, things of this nature? Excel services is another one of the service applications. Search is a service application. The various service applications can have their own settings that can be tweaked and changed over time. When you first install your farm, having certain settings and values might have been sufficient. But as the farm has become used more content is added, you might need to keep an eye and monitor some of these and make some changes to configurations for the various service applications that you have. So trying to stay up on them, keep an eye on it, again, part of that proactive monitoring helps bring some of this to light. It's okay, I might need to go in and make some changes to my search. Maybe I need to implement search more often now, or I have to do some tweaks to some of the settings with regards to Excel services, if that's something that you have available and are leveraging heavily. So be aware you have the various service applications. Many of them have their own settings that you can adjust. So keeping an eye on that and making adjustments as you can will go a long ways to helping keep the farm up and running and keep it healthy and give your users the best possible experience. Tip number 3 is regarding your databases. So managing your databases. As we mentioned, all the content in your SharePoint by default is going to be stored in a database. There can be some, if you're leveraging what is called remote blob storage, or RBS, then the physical document or the image can be stored somewhere else, on a different file share, different storage platform. But there's still entries being made into the content databases for SharePoint. So it's still important that you monitor those and keep an eye on them. The impact that it can have is if you have large content databases, when you are doing backups, and hopefully you are doing backups, the larger contents or the more content you have in there naturally, the longer the backups will take and the more space they will take up, right? It just makes sense. So some of the areas that we recommend taking a look at are the areas such as like the log files. Are they on the same drive as the data files? We recommend you don't have them in the same location, so you help reduce the I/O contention, right, for what's going on. And also some of your built-in databases, especially the system database, like your model database or the temp database. These are some areas that are often, overlooked, but they do have a significant impact on your SharePoint farm. Depending on your architecture and how you do things, right? I don't know how often you may be creating new databases, right? So how often are you creating, you can stand up new site collections and add those to their own separate database. The model database in your SQL instance is what's used to create that database from the beginning. By default, these are the values that are used. A way to help you not have to monitor or have any concerns once that database is stood up is by setting the default values with your model database ahead of time. What do you want your auto growth settings to be? What's going to be the initial size of the database when it gets created, right? These will be some nice little features that will, once the database is created, you may not have to babysit, or you won't have too much of an issue with if you get the settings set properly ahead of time. Now, temp databases, the temp databases in SQL Server are used for every aspect of your SharePoint farm. So anything that you're updating, your temp database is going to come into play at some point or another. So this is one that definitely needs to be looked at. You want to make sure that your temp databases are put on your fastest disk storage media that you can, right? You want to make sure that's like a RAID 10 setup for it. If you can, set up multiple data files for the temp database so that, again, you don't have that I/O contention as you're working and as SharePoint's performing all the various tasks that you have, right? If you're uploading, 50 documents at a time or 100 documents at a time, having the temp database set so that it can allow and consume that kind of a bandwidth, if you will go a long ways to showing and giving your users a much better performance experience. So definitely something to keep an eye on there. Tip number 4 in regards to the servers themselves. So with the servers, for keeping them updated, there's kind of 2 different aspects. There's the actual physical hardware, right? So are you installing the patches and the hot fixes that come out to making sure that the operating system itself on your server is being maintained properly? If the and even for the updates for SharePoint themselves, right? Have you been maintaining and keeping up to date with your SharePoint updates? And we have a little caveat as well. So as important it is to maintain and keep your SharePoint updates, the cumulative updates, if you will, for SharePoint, you also may not want to be on the bleeding edge. You might not want to be the very first people to install a cumulative updates. It's unfortunate, but it's a reality that the patches, the cumulative updates that are sometimes rolled out for SharePoint can cause some issues. There's been times where it might be certain functionality all of a sudden doesn't work properly in SharePoint. There's even been instances where a particular CU has caused a farm to become unusable altogether. So it's unfortunate, but it is a reality. So we typically, as a little guide, recommend wait about 6 months before installing it, right? Let some of the bugs get worked out by some other folks and see if Microsoft then has hot fixes or something. So then you can schedule and plan to get the CU installed, as well as hot fixes that might be necessary to make sure your farm stays up and active. Making some of the changes, again, over time, right? So when you first stood up your SharePoint farm, everything might have been working great because the number of users and the amount of content. As it gets used more, or as your company grows, you've done acquisitions, added new users, started to add additional data into SharePoint to leverage it, that can put an additional load on your machines. So keeping an eye on, how much memory, what's the RAM on your various servers, and the CPU resources, right? How much disk space do you have allocated to these servers, and is it enough? So again, this kind of ties back to the proactive monitoring, right? Keep an eye on what you have there and update and make whatever changes or adjustments to your servers might be needed over time, because the needs will change over time as, like I say, as the usage changes, right? Okay, tip number 5, around governing your farm. So why is this important for, helping with the health of your farms? Being able to control and see, what content and knowing when to add things, right? SharePoint, it's very easy to, just have users, upload all kinds of different documents and images and files, whatever they're going to be storing there. But are they having the correct content and the correct information, right? So, we have the quote there, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? one of the examples I have used in the past is, I've been with companies in the past that, because everybody's used to Excel, right? Everybody loves Excel, especially in your finance departments, and you've got some, real wizards with playing with Excel. I've had a company where they had like over 20 years worth of content stored in one Excel document. And it was a big Excel document. And we would often get complaints about, why does it take so long to open this Excel document in SharePoint? And because it's such a large file, for one thing, but also it's a concern that it's 20 years worth of financial data being stored in it. It's like, does that really pass audit? There might be another way to do that. So just because you can store that much data in Excel, should you, right? So same with different aspects of SharePoint. You can create subsites or additional site collections, but should you? What are the standards that you want to have in place for your company for moving forward, right? Who's going to control the permissions for the site? Are you establishing individual site owners for each site? Or is that being handled at a higher level? Maybe your site collection administrators. And the folks who have been given this control, do they understand what your governance model is? Do they understand why and how to do things and what the impact is or could be to the SharePoint farm? For instance, your lists and libraries. Are they using versioning for the document libraries? If they are, awesome. That could be a very powerful feature, and it's a good feature to have. But if they are turning on versioning, are they also putting in controls such as, controlling how many major versions they have or minor versions so that the libraries don't get too large? Depending on the version of SharePoint you have, this could have a very big impact. So if you don't turn on versioning, you could have versions of documents, like 2,000 plus versions of, this large Word document or a Visio document. And 2,000 versions is creating a copy of that possibly in some of the older versions of SharePoint. So that's taking up a lot of space in your content database. So again, the content database getting real large, how much space is it taking, how long does it take for the backups, etc. So making sure they understand what is the standard, what do we want to do? We always want to set the number of versions that are being controlled, right? Don't just openly have versioning in place. Setting the permissions and making sure people understand how to give permissions. Are we using the SharePoint groups or adding individual users, etc. So governing that farm, making sure the people, in the right roles understand what the standards are that you wish to have and how to enforce them in your various farm setups. Tip number 6. So be aware of the logging. There's various types of logging, okay? So one that we're kind of focused on here are your ULS logs. There are SQL database logs, so most definitely be aware of that. Hopefully your DBAs are keeping an eye on it and making sure there's enough space for it. But what are the nice features within SharePoint? If you are having some kind of an issue, you're getting some complaint or whatever, or you yourself have noticed something happening in your farm, enabling what the ULS logging in your SharePoint farm can really help you troubleshoot it. By default, the setting for the logging is set to a level that shouldn't be too invasive, shouldn't cause too much of a problem with the performance of your servers in your farm. But you can increase that level, what they call make it verbose, right? Which means I want to capture everything that's happening with this particular aspect of SharePoint. And there are a lot of detailed areas. You want to get real specific to just Excel services or just search. Whatever the case may be, there's quite a few areas where you can tweak your settings there. And it can be very nice and very powerful to help you troubleshoot. But we've seen many a time where folks have gone in, they've changed the level of logging for their ULS logs, done their troubleshooting, went through the log files, found the problem, hopefully, and have moved on. They decided this is what needed to be done, whatever the case may be, and change, and everybody's happy. But then they forget to go back and reset the logging level. So if you have that on verbose, and what we've also seen a lot of times is people just like check every box because they don't really know exactly what they want to look at. So they check every box, so yes, make it verbose for everything in my farm. That's now going to really have an impact on your performance, right? And then also for the storage space that's being consumed. So definitely want to make sure that you periodically go back and check and look at, in central admin, what is your logging set to? Has somebody, increased the level, or, is everything looking the default settings and everything looks okay? So be aware of them. Definitely take the time to look at that. It's an easy one for people to forget. Tip number 7, managing your service applications. So much like we mentioned earlier, there are several aspects for the different service applications that you have, right? But there's also some other areas that you can work with. Search is one of the big ones that the different components of search. Who's doing the crawling, who's doing the indexing, who's serving up the information, who's handling all the different queries, right? So looking at the service applications and seeing how you might need to grow or make some adjustments over time. Is everything running on just one machine in your farm, or do you have multiple machines in your farm? Do you have enough RAM? Is that being pegged out to 100% all the time, or even your CPU? Is that constantly, being overtaxed on these machines? So if you do see that your RAM and your CPU is very regularly, hitting 100% or being maxed out, you might want to start looking at, okay, do we need to add another server? How are we going to, separate this information out? Is it enough that going from a single machine to, 2 machines, have that second machine be used for, as what they call a web front end. So that's the machine that is largely responsible for rendering the site back to your users, right? You might also need to add some extra service to help with search. Maybe the search is a very critical piece and you've got a lot of content that needs to be indexed. And you're running search, on a fairly constant, regular basis, right? So being able to have that machines and separate that workload, right? Spread the workload across multiple machines to help increase the performance. So knowing what's available, what you can do with the various service applications and how to spread that workload out can make a big difference in your farm and what you're doing. Now, a little cautionary tale for you here regarding, like a single machine that I mentioned. And we have seen this. It is fairly consistent that people are having a single machine in their farm. I strongly recommend that you make every effort you can to get at least one other machine in your farm. Okay, we've come across a couple different scenarios where something catastrophic has happened, a configuration database has become corrupt for one reason or another, and having to get some information, like there's an important piece of information when a farm is stood up called a passphrase. And if you haven't properly tracked and don't know what your passphrase is, again, I recommend find out what that passphrase is. There's some PowerShell commands that you can do. Capture that, save that off someplace that you will always have access to it and be able to get to it. You need that passphrase if you are going to add some additional servers to your farm and some other aspects. That passphrase is very important. If your configuration database and the machine that you're running on has gotten certain levels of corruption, you're going to have a hard time trying to find that passphrase. Whereas if you've got a second machine and that machine isn't having the same kind of issues or problems, you can run some script on that machine since it's already in the farm and recognized as a member of your farm. That kind of gives you like another option for running some PowerShell script to get information such as that passphrase. And there's some additional benefits again to having that second machine added to your farm. Again, even if it is just that one role of what we call the web front end, that's fine. Then it doesn't have to be quite as beefy of a machine, but having that extra server available in case something goes wrong with one of your other application servers, having that already in the farm set up and running could be a big benefit. So definitely, if you can do that, get at least a second machine added to your farm. Then I'm going to turn it back over to Ted, who's going to, nope, I'm sorry, we've got one more here as far as training your users. So why is that important? So again, keeping your farm healthy. This kind of ties back to the earlier slide also about just because you can doesn't mean you should. SharePoint is often touted as being rather intuitive and easy to use. I know there's a big debate on that. Some people don't necessarily agree with that. But being able to just get onto a SharePoint server and start uploading documents. I'm going to start dragging and dropping and throwing all kinds of content out here and getting it uploaded and it's done. So real easy to do. But training your users and making them understand what the various impact is, especially the users who have the elevated rights, okay? Who are your site owners or your site collection admins? do they have the training to understand some of the impacts and the when to do a thing, what the best practices are, will be very important. Sometimes, a couple different, examples are people that, might be added into a SharePoint group, right? And there's a setting that you can turn on that says the members of this group can manage other members. So, which means they can add or remove people to that SharePoint group. That could be good or it could be bad, right? So maybe Mary is a member of a particular group and Bob calls her and says, hey, I can't get access to this content. Can you help me with this? And Mary's like, well, I know I can get it. Here, let me add you to this group so that you can get into this database or access that content as well. But she's not been trained properly and isn't aware that adding Bob to that group also gives him access to a lot of other content that he probably shouldn't have access to, right? So once you start getting all these invalid permissions and giving people access to content that they shouldn't, can cause all kinds of problems as far as security, but also just, the bloat, having to deal with controlling and fixing these permissions later, trying to identify where the issues are, all leads to, again, a certain state of unhealthiness, both for your SharePoint farm and for, any of you folks who are the administrators of your SharePoint farm. That will go a long way with, setting some of your sanity just within yourselves. So taking the time to make sure, your users have been trained the right way to work with SharePoint, how to deal with SharePoint, what are the pros and cons of different things, right? Mapping network drives can be a big deal, and people do that, but there are certain pros and cons you need to be aware of with that. So making sure they understand what the expectations are and how to use SharePoint, giving them that training, especially, again, the people with the elevated rights, your site owners, your site collection admins. At a minimum, please give them the proper training that they need so that they have the knowledge to make sure they are doing things properly in SharePoint. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Ted, who will cover a couple more aspects. So the final two tips for you folks.
Thanks, Brian. So, this is one of those completely no-brainer tips that everybody should have completely mastered by now. There's even a World Backup Day, but performing regular backups, so no-brainer, but so rarely do we see good execution here. And where we find that things often fall down is, again, going back to the planning phase is around strategy. So it's very important to determine what your RTO, which is your recovery time objective, which is basically how long of an outage is the business willing to accept, and then your RPO, which is your recovery point objective. And your recovery point objective defines how much data is the business willing to lose. And, it's real easy to say 0 to both of those numbers, but, the reality is that, a recovery time of an aggressive RTO and RPO come at a cost. You need to implement redundancies, and you need to have a lot of storage for more frequent backups. But all of, RTO and RPO are all based on the criticality of your farm. So of those 20, mid 20% or so of the folks on the phone who have a very critical SharePoint environment, these are questions that need to be asked and by the business. Okay, these aren't something for your IT department to decide. IT should take what the business tells them in this scenario, but it works in the reverse 9 times out of 10, and that is they make, IT does their best. They make assumptions, and then things change, and then there's a failure, and they have to restore from backup, and users end up with an unacceptable amount of either downtime or data loss. So defining these critical SLAs is just one of the most important things that you can do. And SharePoint is a unique animal, and just taking uncoordinated snapshots of the virtual machines that make up your SharePoint farm is not the way to back SharePoint up. So what you need to think of SharePoint as it is orchestration platform, and it's orchestrating a web server, it's orchestrating application servers, it's orchestrating database servers. And if you just take a snapshot of one in time, a snapshot of another in time, and there was a transaction occurring either in between or during those snapshots, when you restore those virtual machines, you could end up with a farm in a corrupted state. So there are lots of utilities out there, and there are built-in backup features within SharePoint itself. So make sure that you're managing your disaster recovery activities in alignment with best practices. And most of all, for all you business users out there, or for you folks on the IT side, make sure that there's agreement on an acceptable RTO and RPO, and make sure it's revisited once a year, because the criticality of your SharePoint server will change over time as new features get added. So again, no-brainer kind of tip, but rarely do we see good execution. And this, which leads to tip number 10: how do you know that you've got a good backup strategy? Well, the first way is by performing a disaster recovery simulation. So you need to go through the hard work of, and it's only hard in the beginning until you get into a routine and can deploy some automation, but you need to go through the hard work of actually restoring the data and testing it. And this has to be done on a periodic basis. And how frequency those periods are, again, depends on the criticality of your SharePoint farm. So, that was one of the motivations behind us implementing that poll early on in the presentation, is we want to get you thinking about it. The more critical your farm, the more frequent your backups, your RTO, RPO, the more aggressive those need to be defined. And then also, the more frequently you need to be performing DR simulations. And it's not one of those that you can set and forget. The only way to ensure a working farm is to restore regularly. The good news is that much of this can be automated. So, there are a ton of PowerShell scripts that can be leveraged to automate a lot of these steps. There are a lot of third-party utilities, like I mentioned on the last slide, and there's a built-in backup features within SharePoint itself. One thing to keep in mind that is very critical is the more painful the process is, the less likely it is to get done. And that's not because IT folks are lazy and they avoid anything hard. It's just the reality of the world today is that IT, just like everybody else, has competing priorities. And if you've got a big, hairy process that requires a lot of manual time, finding room on the calendar to make that happen can sometimes be a challenge, and those things get pushed off. And what I would say, being a former IT auditor, one of the most critical things that you can do to ensure that proper DR simulations are taking place is to create an audit trail. So anytime an administrator goes about the process of doing a DR simulation, they need to have the steps documented, the dates the steps were performed, and the output. So success or not success, partial success. You can manage all that in a SharePoint list, but there needs to be some transparency around it, because it's very difficult for the business or even IT leadership to have transparency around or visibility to when these DR simulations are taking place. Because the reality is, you won't know that they're not taking place if you haven't created an audit trail until you need to restore from backup and it doesn't work. And there's a ton of different reasons why you can set a backup strategy today and do a DR simulation tomorrow, and then a year from now you assume that it's good. Ton of reasons why that may not be the case, And the main reason is the environmental factors change. So, maybe service account passwords have changed. Maybe there's been encryption employed into the backup process that wasn't. You don't have your decryption process documented. Maybe space constraints have changed, or space requirements no longer fit within the space constraints. So creating an audit trail around your DR simulations is a very, very good idea. And that's really the last tip. So, you guys have a lot of information here at your disposal, and if you follow these tips, you're guaranteed a healthy SharePoint environment. The key takeaway is that all the tasks are ongoing. There are no set and forget processes here. Even governance, which sounds very much like a discrete activity. I do it once, I define what the rules of the road are, and then I go about my business, and we use our SharePoint farm, and we're good. No, governance needs to be revisited also. Why? Because things change. So, you may have, even if nothing changes within your business, capabilities within SharePoint change. So you roll out a new update, or if you're leveraging a hybrid environment, new capabilities get exposed in Office 365. Well, how are those going to be managed? What are the rules of the road? OneDrive is a great example. So, OneDrive is a fairly new addition to SharePoint Online and Office 365. So if, with that new capability coming online, what are the governance policies going to be around that? Are you going to be able to store client data in there? Are you going to leverage it at all? Is it going to be disabled? So again, governance needs to be revisited frequently. Once a year is probably a good rule of the road. But if there are events, it's kind of like your insurance policy. Once a year you have your renewal, and you have to put some thought into this, unless there's a life-changing event like you have a child. Same thing holds true with your SharePoint environment. Once a year, revisit it, take a look at it. If you make a major upgrade in the middle of the year, you need to take a look at your governance policies then. Okay, so some good news here is if you're looking for a way to evaluate where your firm stands with what we've outlined here, we have a very inexpensive service offering to help you do that. It's called SharePoint MD. So we come in, we do a complete audit of your SharePoint farm, and we review your security posture. We make recommendations for improved performance. We evaluate your firm's migration readiness, either to the next version of SharePoint, or if you're thinking about hybrid, we give you a migration readiness score if you want to move to the cloud. SharePoint MD is $2,500 per SharePoint farm, so it's not something that you really need to have a big budget line item scheduled out in the previous budget cycle to make a reality, and it's a great way to figure out where you stand today. So if you'd like more information on that, please reach out to us at info@acrowire.com, and we'd be more than happy to talk to you about it. So I'm going to go ahead and, Gail, if it's okay, we have a question here that I'd like to present to Brian.
Okay, but before you do that, I just want to mention, everyone, that we are kind of doing things a little differently with our evaluation. So while Brian and Ted are handling the questions, go ahead and answer the poll that I just put up. I'd appreciate that. And, this will give us better information on how we want to go with our evaluation. So go ahead, Brian and Ted.
Okay. So one question that we have is, what's the best way to back up SharePoint?
Wow. Okay. So yeah,
That's a loaded one.
It is a loaded one. Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to give the dreaded contractor answer. It depends, right? There is no easy button for it. Again, as Ted mentioned, regarding the RPO and the RTO with your backups, working with the business to know what the requirements are, right? What version of SharePoint you're running also will have an impact. Why I say that is because, again, like Ted mentions, even capabilities with SharePoint changed, right? So if you're running, SharePoint 2010 SP2 or above, one of the new capabilities that they implemented is regarding the recycle bin. If you delete a site, that gets stored in the recycle bin now. If you are running a version earlier than that of SharePoint, sites are not stored in the recycle bin. So as you can imagine, that would have an impact on your backups and what's available, right? What are the expectations from the business? Do you need to have item level restore capability? What do I mean by that? Are the user's expectations to be able to reach out to IT and say, hey, I had a version of document X that existed 3 days ago, and somebody has put some information in there. We didn't have versioning turned on, and now I need to go back and get that version of that document, right? So getting that information, that all comes into play to determine what can you do. Having that item level restore is not available out of the box with the SharePoint backups, right? The built-in SharePoint backups that you have, those are very good, but primarily around disaster recovery. Again, they don't help you with your item level kind of backups. Doing that farm backup, I think, is an important piece. The farm level that's built into SharePoint and central admin, most definitely a key piece to it. The SQL backups and server backups, most definitely they come into play, right? So having those databases backed up and maintained, that all is part of your planning, right? So when it comes time for restores, right? Or, what are you trying, as part of your backup, what is the goal? Are you only concerned about disaster recovery, right? My farm's been wiped out and I now need to get my farm up and running again in the fastest way possible. Is that the main purpose in what you're trying to achieve? Or again, we start getting back into the item level restores, right? Is that an expectation of your businesses, of your business users? If it is, then you need to be looking at some other third-party kinds of products to say, okay, I now need to have this item level backups so that I can have something to go back into some point in time to say, I need document X from this particular date. Now, that then introduces another level of complexity. How far back can they go? What are the expectations? What is your SLA with the business, right? And maybe it's based on what area of your business, how critical is that information? Are you required through some particular standard, or whether it's an industry standard? Do you have to have the ability to go back 6 months, 9 months? Do you only need to go back a week or two? These are all the different questions that have to be asked and addressed to know what kind of a backup plan you're going to use, what tools are available, and how to handle and work with those. You then need to make sure you address what is the process. So if somebody does need to get something restored, how do they go about requesting it? What should their expectations be as far as the time, right? How long will it take to get that one single document restored again, okay? Keep in mind, when you're looking at these backups and what happens, the recycle bin is very powerful for SharePoint, right? So anytime you've deleted an item in a list or library, deleted the actual list or library itself, that gets stored in the recycle bin, and your sites get stored in the recycle bins. So I believe by default you have 30 days that's stored in there. So this is something that you need to take into account and consider. Make sure, again, have you trained your users? Are they aware of that recycle bin and what it can do? That can save you a lot of headaches when it comes times for doing different restores and where they're going to get that information from. But it doesn't necessarily address every scenario, right? So
Okay.
Go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, so I was going to say I got another question that came in here, and it was about how do customizations / add-ins affect SharePoint health? And this is a good one because it's one that we see, especially in legal. There's a lot of third-party frameworks out there: Handshake, BA Insight, ProsperaWare, DocAuto. lot of add-ins that you can deploy with SharePoint, and there's also just native third-party customizations that that maybe a developer in your firm writes. Or another example of customization would be you've implemented some custom branding within your farm. How that affects SharePoint Health is it creates potential risk. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means that you need to be aware. So, for example, branding, if you've got a branding package that drastically alters the UI of SharePoint, you are setting yourself up for problems. The next service pack or CU you deploy could potentially break the branding pages that you have in place. Again, nothing wrong with deploying a third-party product if the requirements dictate that you need a search framework. But we see a lot of folks kind of get chasing shiny objects, and hey, this is a new whiz-bang product, let's deploy it. And if the business requirements dictate that, then it's worth the risk, potentially. If not, then it's not worth the risk. So customizations can be tricky, and how you go about if you're doing them in-house, make sure you're using the add-in model, for example, or something that is cloud friendly, because it's just a matter of time before you're going to end up there, at least in a hybrid state. So building new customizations that are cloud compatible is a good idea. Okay, Brian, this one is, and I don't know how much information we have on this because I don't think 2016 is RTM yet. I think it's still, or is it? Did 2016 RTM yet?
I have to admit, I'm not sure. I don't think it is. I thought it was, the RTC, or I can't remember what the acronym is for it. But it's out there and available for people, but there might still be some changes before it goes full RTM. Hopefully they won't be anything too drastic.
Yeah, I think that it's supposed to happen in May, which is just a few weeks away, last I heard. But the question is, how difficult is it to upgrade from 2013 to 2016, and will everything migrate over?
Wow.
And, I'll give you my quick answer and then turn it over to Brian. The reality is there's not been a lot of experience around this. We really only have what Microsoft is telling us, because nobody's really upgrading yet, because the release to market, RTM stands for release to market. Those bits haven't been finalized. So not a lot of real world experience upgrading from 2013 to 2016. In the past, moving from one version to another, not skipping a version, has been supported. And you always have the migration option too. Brian, do you have anything else to add to that?
If memory serves, you're not going to have any kind of an in-place upgrade, right? Meaning I have these same set of servers and farms, and all I have to do is, flick the magic button that says, yeah, go ahead and let's, run an upgrade, and it changes your database schemas, etc. You're still going to have to stand up a separate SharePoint 2016 farm, do a database detach and attach, bring it over to the new 2016 version, and run the upgrade process there, right? So it'll fix any of the schema changes, et cetera, that are necessary. With any migration, the other piece that you need to consider, and that's why, that the term is easy to do. Also, just like what Ted mentioned, what configurations, what customizations have you done, right? Have you installed some third-party products from Bamboo or some other well-known vendors for SharePoint capabilities? Do they have a 2016 version, or some version of that same tool that will install in 2016, right? So you'll need to make sure that whatever customizations you have from that perspective, custom apps you might have installed from the SharePoint store, for example, right? So how that migration is going to happen depends a lot from farm to farm, right? From different companies. What you have in place, what you've done, how large are your databases? Do you just want to do, what we call a lift and shift? Just take what I've got in my current farm and bring it over to the new farm. That could be good, but if you're having certain issues or concerns on your farm, do you want to bring over those same issues and concerns into your new world, or do you want to address them now and take care of them? Such as, maybe you've got everything going into one content database, and that content database is now like 300 gigabytes or bigger, right? Do you really want to keep bringing that over into the new world, or do you want to re-architect? Do you want to start looking at moving things in a different way to help keep your databases, a more manageable size? Also around, at that point, it's a good time to think about, what we were mentioning as far as backups, right? What is the critical information? You might want to separate out your data. So it's like, yes, this data, this SharePoint site collection is much more important and more dynamic than, say, some other site collection, right? Not to put down HR, but let's say, some of the information that's going in HR about, the new forms and what's going on in the processes. That data may not need to be backed up quite as often and be made available quite as quickly as a SharePoint site collection that's storing information about your matters or your document management system. What interaction do you have there? That might be a lot more critical. So that one might need to be backed up more often and have a restore process that's much more streamlined than HR. You can split those out into their own content databases so that they each can have their own backup plan in place for them, right? So that might be a good time to separate that out when you do your upgrade to the next version of SharePoint, be it 2016 or any other version.
Okay, we've got one more, and I'll take a stab at this. The question is, would moving to SharePoint Online or Office 365 remove many of these concerns about backup and security? And the short answer is yes. So with SharePoint Online, you don't even have access to central admin to perform any sort of backups yourself. There are some tools out there. We haven't used them, but I know they exist. That if you don't trust that Microsoft's going to get you back up within your RPO and RTO tolerances, there are some tools out there where you can do a cloud-to-cloud backup. So pull your content out of SharePoint Online and move it to to Azure Blob Storage, for example. So the whole premise behind Office 365 is it's software as a service, and you don't have to manage server level tasks and backups and fall into that. Security, that's a little bit of a different animal because you still control security. So you still need to have that dialogue that Brian mentioned earlier about how are you going to manage, SharePoint groups? Are you going to use Azure AD? What about external users? What's your policy? You can now grant access very easily to users outside your organization in SharePoint Online using Microsoft Live IDs. How is that going to be managed? So on the backups front, it happens out of the box, but you can also add another layer to that if the circumstances dictate. And then security is still in your hands. You still have to manage that. And Gail, that takes us right to the top of the hour.
Okay, great. Well, once again, thank you, Ted and Brian, for providing this great information on this topic. And I also want to thank AccuWire for sponsoring. Please remember that a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and a link to the recording will be posted on our website in a few days. And you will still be receiving the old-fashioned email survey, so please fill them out if you can. They're important to us. We want to make sure that we continue to provide quality, timely educational opportunities for our member. All right, folks, that's it for today. Keep an eye on our website for any upcoming meetings and webinars. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.